Thank you. I expect there are many questions. If everybody wants to stretch for 5 seconds, brain and body, and then stretch your hand up and we'll start taking questions. As usual, please keep them short so I can paraphrase them for the World Wide Web. I'll start right at the back.
Yes. Selection with regards to traits in connection with human evolution. And you said that there was a very fast rate of speed of evolution over time in regards to selection for intelligence or larger brain size as much as they're related. Could you point out whether that selection occurred in the sense of sexual selection, or was it some other driver within the social fabric that caused this rather?
So the question is, can we pinpoint what aspect of sociality drove this amazing change in brain size? I.e., was it, for instance, sexual selection, or was it something else?
That's a really, really good question. And there is a fellow named Dan Nettle over in the UK who has done such things as measuring mating success of people, which is kind of fiddly to measure. He's measured mating success in comparison to measures of schizotypy, that is schizophrenia-like cognition. So you can give people a test and then put them on a scale of how sort of schizophrenia-like they are. And he has found associations between those. And he puts this sort of in the context of relatively artistic people, artists, musicians, sort of arts and literature people tending to have higher mating success, presumably, than us scientific and engineering sorts of people. So that's the sort of evidence we have now. It really is extremely difficult, though, to study sexual selection in extant humans. I mean, you could start to get a handle if you were to look for effects of variation in some of these genes I've talked about. Do they have effects on phenotypes that are related to sexual selection, for example? Okay, that would be something to look at. So certainly there's no hard evidence. There is a little bit of evidence like that Nettle has developed, but one could certainly make that more rigorous.
And it's never just one thing. Yes, and then over here. Yeah, right here, and then. Go ahead.
Thanks. The social brain hypothesis is convincing because many areas of the brain are involved in these different faculties, and so the brain is expanding. But in earlier attempts at understanding why our brains got big quickly, it was associated with bipedalism. Was that a correlation which didn't pan out, or is it just out of fashion? And
the question is, past discussions of why our brains got so big centered on bipedalism, not on the social brain. And so is it new data that's changed our minds, or is it just something that's gone out of fashion? And we did discuss that briefly last week, but do you have a comment?
Well, one line of evidence on that question is just the sequence of events in human evolution, specifically that bipedalism apparently evolved well before major brain expansion. So bipedalism could certainly have been important in being sort of a necessary condition for what came later. But in terms of actually coinciding with or directly precipitating brain increase, one really can't point to any evidence for that. One has the problem that bipedalism has not evolved multiple times, and we don't have whales that walk, that sort of thing. So it's very hard to use the comparative method on that question. So it is a very hard question, but the sequence of events doesn't seem to support it.
And that's what Dr. Collard was also pointing to last week, was that we stood up long before our brains got big, and so there's been this decoupling. So here, yeah.
On all of your charts, it shows that autism on the left. It seems to appear very early in life. What triggers the other end of the spectrum to appear throughout the adult life, like schizophrenia, depression, paranoia. Those don't show up early. Why do they take so long to appear?
So there's this difference in the expression of the two sort of ends of the spectrum, where autism appears very early, but your right side, so the schizophrenic symptoms, tend to appear later and more continually. And is there a reason for that?
Well, I would say that if you're going to have the social brain get overdeveloped, then it has to develop essentially, more or less normally to get to that stage. Okay, so if we're talking about hyperdevelopment of the social brain, well, it takes 18 years. I mean, this essentially would be what I would argue what childhood, the extended human childhood, is all about. Okay, is feeding that social brain, developing that social brain to a sufficient extent that one is a socially competitive and socially successful individual. So from a developmental perspective, which is a critical perspective, with autism, the social brain doesn't develop. With schizophrenia, it has to develop to a certain point in order to essentially overdevelop. There's all sorts of major changes that go on in late adolescence in the brain, major reorganizations that are seen specifically to sort of precipitate these sorts of disorders. And those are all changes that are specifically involved in maturation of the social brain, I would argue.
Here, and then over here.
Do you see the same spectrum of behaviors, autism to schizophrenia, in the lower primates?
So the question is, do you see the spectrum that we've been talking about in other primates?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and people haven't looked very much. There are models of autism that are based on primates. So for example, if you give a primate a lesion to their amygdala, their social behavior will be severely impaired. Okay, they won't be scared of the dominant male. They'll do all sorts of extremely socially unwise things, and they'll be ostracized essentially from the group. Now, as far as anything resembling schizophrenia or bipolar, I mean, the place to look would be in chimpanzees, which are by far the closest to us. And I've only seen, I think, only a single paper that has even addressed the issue of interpreting variation in chimpanzee behavior in terms of disorders. Now, certainly, if you read Goodall's book, you know that there are chimpanzees with highly aberrant behavior, and they have very individualistic personalities. But I think it's difficult to fit those aberrant personalities in the context of, for example, schizophrenia, because schizophrenia, the phenotypes of schizophrenia really are tightly tied to traits which are very highly developed just in humans. So language in particular, thought disorder, auditory hallucination. You basically can't get that sort of thing in a chimpanzee, which doesn't have complex and symbolic language. So I would say, yes, there's certainly mental disorders in other primates, but they're going to be simpler and different from what we have.
So here, yeah.
So you said socialization affected human brain size and complexity. So there are animals or insects that are highly socialized, and do they have larger or complex brain compared to their ancestors?
So the question was, this argument is that sociality is associated with brain size and some other correlates of brain size. If we look at other social animals, social insects even, do they also have larger brains than their close relatives?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and people have addressed that. When the social brain hypothesis came along and got tested in primates, people went out and started looking in other groups. And it has been supported, by my recollection, in ungulates, and I think also in bats. You have essentially the same pattern. I don't believe it's been tested in cetaceans, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but that is definitely a place where one should look, because if you're looking at the pinnacles of social brain development, then you're looking at a bottlenose dolphin. And bottlenose dolphins, it's well known that they have extremely complex social behavior involving these coalitions and super coalitions between males, individual recognition. They're very long-lived, long parental care. So they really seem to have, and the social system is kind of a fission-fusion system, which is similar to what you have in chimpanzees, for example. So there's all sorts of parallels there in terms of complex sociality and brain size, but I don't think that's been tested comparatively in the cetaceans.
In the whales. So, Madam.